Okay, so in this unit, we're talking about Earth's resources. So we have talked about the types of rocks, and we've talked about landforms. So now we're going to talk, this is going to be a two video because you're doing it on 2 different days. So today we're going to talk about weathering. Tomorrow you're going to talk about erosion and deposition. So there's a Generation Genius you're doing on this. But we're going to talk a little bit about the specific weathering versus erosion and deposition. So today we're going to talk all about weathering. And weathering is when rocks break down into smaller pieces. So when little chunks of the rocks break off. Now, we can either have physical weathering, and that's what we mostly see, and most weathering is physical weathering. But there are some times when we might see chemical weathering. So we're going to talk about the differences in those. So one difference is when physical weathering happens, it's the same rock. Nothing on the rock changes. It just breaks off into smaller pieces. So if it's sandstone, with physical weathering, it stays sandstone. The rock does not change. The size of the rock changes. Now, some things that can cause physical weathering are wind. So if it's really windy, as the wind, just hits against the rock, it can carry off, tiny, tiny particles, sometimes maybe even smaller than you could see, but it can carry off small pieces of the rock. Water is a very, very big cause of physical weathering, and it can happen in a couple different ways. So one, think about rivers. As the rivers run, down in the riverbed that you can't see because it's covered in water, there's rock. So as that water is running over that riverbed, it's going to carry away small pieces of rock. Another example of water physical erosion or physical weathering is in the ocean. Things as the ocean waves crash, if there's rocks on the shore that the ocean waves are constantly hitting and coming back, they're going to weather, they're going to carry away small pieces of that rock. Ice is another example. So when water freezes into ice, it expands. And then when it melts, it contracts. So think about the ice storm we had. If you had cracks in your sidewalk that water got in and it froze, that ice expanded. And then when it got warm enough and it started to thaw, it got back small. But when it contracted, when it melted, it could have probably pulled away. It might not have, but in ice weathering, it can pull away small particles of that. The last example of water weathering is just rain. As it rains and, you get, sometimes if it rains, you might see in a parking lot like a little stream. That's just going to carry away small pieces. Another example of weathering, physical weathering, is through plants. So we're going to go back to the sidewalk example. Have you ever seen little plants pop up in a sidewalk that are, growing through cracks? So as that happens, or anywhere that you see plants growing through rocks, they're setting their root system, they're establishing themselves, and so they're expanding, and they can weather small pieces of rock away with them. So we had for physical weathering, we had wind, we had 4 different ways of water, and we had plants. For chemical weathering, it's not common, but when that happens, remember physical weathering, it was the same rock, just smaller. If it was sandstone, even when it was weathered away, it was still sandstone. With chemical, the chemicals in the weathering change the rock, so we get smaller pieces, but we get smaller pieces of a different rock than the original one. The way that's going to happen is through acid rain. So if acid rain comes in, that's going to cause chemical weathering, and something that could cause, where you could know that it was different than the original, it could change the color of the rock. So today we did weathering. We're going to have one on erosion and deposition for your next lesson.